Before I say anything else, I want you to think about where you are right now. Maybe you're in your bedroom. Maybe you're on your couch. Maybe you have headphones in and the rest of the house is quiet behind you. Now I want you to sit with this one question. How would you know if someone was in that house with you right now? Not breaking in, not making noise, just there, patient, quiet, the way they've been every single night for the past 3 weeks while you slept 10 feet away. How would you know? The 3 people in tonight's stories asked themselves that exact question, but they asked it too late. Welcome to True Terror Files Official, where the stories are real. The dread is earned, and by the time you reach the end, you will not feel completely safe in your own home. If tonight is your first time here, I'm glad you found us, and I'm sorry about what comes next. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a night like this one. Tonight we have 3 accounts, 3 real experiences that all share the same terrifying truth. That the most frightening thing in the world is not the monster under the bed or the shadow at the end of the street. It is the slow, creeping realization that something has been sharing your space, your routines, your life, and you never once noticed. The first story is about a man who moved into a new apartment and started finding small things missing. Food, fork, a phone charger, until the day a maintenance man opened a panel in his bathroom and found something that made the color drain from his face. The second is about a young woman whose elderly neighbor spent weeks desperately trying to warn her, and what she found in his notebook after he passed away. And the third, the one I keep coming back to, the one that hasn't left me since I first heard it, is about a man who waved to his neighbor at the edge of the tree line every evening before dinner. And the night his wife told him that neighbor hadn't lived there in 3 weeks. Lights off if you can. These stories were made for the dark. Let's begin. Story 1. The Thing in the Walls. James Mercer was 31 years old, a project manager who had just taken a new position that required him to relocate to a mid-sized city on the East Coast. And when he found the apartment, 3rd floor of a converted brick building in a clean, quiet neighborhood, affordable, close to the office, good light through the windows, he signed the lease the same afternoon he toured it and moved in with 4 boxes and a mattress and the modest relief of a man starting over in a city where no one knew his name. And by the end of his first week, he had settled into the rhythm of someone building a new routine from scratch. Coffee at 7, work by 8, home by 6, dinner, television, sleep, and everything was manageable. Everything was ordinary, and the first strange thing was so small he nearly didn't register it. A phone charger he was certain he had left on the kitchen counter appeared on the bathroom shelf the next morning, and he assumed he had moved it in a distracted moment, the way you do when your mind is elsewhere. And then it was a fork from the drying rack that appeared in the silverware drawer when he hadn't touched it. And then it was food. Half a container of pasta he had been saving for lunch. Simply gone. No wrapper in the trash. No evidence of anything. Just absent. And James was a rational person. The kind of man who believed in simple explanations and had no patience for the ones that weren't. And so he blamed the stress of relocation, told himself he was more distracted than he realized, and it was 3 weeks into his tenancy, lying in bed with the lights off, that he heard the wall breathe, and that word breathe was the only word he could ever find for it afterward. A long, slow, pressurized sound from somewhere inside the wall directly behind his headboard. Not a pipe settling, not the building contracting in the cold. Something organic, something paced, something that happened and then paused and then happened again, and James lay completely still and listened, and then turned on every light in the apartment and found nothing and called himself ridiculous. And in the morning left a message for the building's maintenance line, explaining that he thought there might be something wrong with the wall in the bedroom, and the maintenance man who came the following day, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Ray, who had worked in that building for 11 years, and had the bearing of a man who had seen every possible apartment problem, went first to the bathroom because James mentioned the sound had seemed to originate somewhere near that side of the unit. And Ray opened a standard access panel beside the sink, the kind of panel that exists in every older building for plumbing access. And then he did not say anything, and he did not move. And James came to stand behind him and looked through the open panel into the crawl space behind the wall. A narrow gap, maybe 2 feet across, dark, running horizontally along the back of the bathroom and continuing, as Ray would explain. Behind the walls of every unit on this side of the building and connecting to the adjacent units through gaps in the original construction that had never been sealed, and what James saw in that crawl space was a sleeping bag rolled tightly and pushed against the far wall, and beside it a plastic bag containing food wrappers and a crushed water bottle. Through the small battery-powered camping lantern with the switch set to off, and then propped against the sleeping bag, a plastic sleeve containing a stack of photographs printed on standard paper, and James reached in and took them and held them under the bathroom light. Through the bathroom vent, through the bedroom vent, through the kitchen 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 vent, print and vent, front vent, and a front event, and end of end s ben and into down what the end I went to the pie and it was with but spice and I want see so bells I would one day Photographs of him sleeping in his bed and standing at the stove and sitting at his laptop and watching television on the couch. And each photograph was dated in small, careful handwriting at the bottom, and the dates went back for months. For months before James had ever signed his lease or set foot in the city. And the first photographs in the stack were not of James at all, but of the previous tenant, a woman in her early 30s he had never met. And then there was a gap of perhaps 3 weeks. And then James's own face, on the very first day he moved in, carrying one of his boxers through the front door, shot through the kitchen vent from the darkness inside the wall, and James set the photographs down on the edge of the sink very carefully, and Ray called the building manager, and then the police, and James stood in his kitchen and waited. And while he waited, he thought about the missing pasta, and the fork in the drawer, and the phone charger on the bathroom shelf, and he thought about the sound like breathing in the wall behind his head, and he thought about the fact that the crawl space connected to every unit on his side of the building, which meant that whoever had been in those walls for at least 4 months, watching through the vents. Coming out in the night to move through his kitchen and take food and leave small, careful traces of themselves and return before morning, had been close enough on many nights to stand directly beside him while he slept, and had chosen not to, and James told a friend later that what he could not resolve years afterward is not the fear of what might have happened, but the specific cold question of what the person in the walls had actually wanted, because they had taken so little and been so careful and left so few traces, and had clearly been content for months with simply being near him without his knowledge, and James could not decide, and still cannot decide, whether that patience was the most frightening part, or whether the most frightening part was the thing he realized only after moving out, when a neighbor told him that the previous female tenant had not actually moved out voluntarily, that she had broken her lease in the middle of the night and left most of her belongings behind, and had refused to say why. Story 2. I think my neighbor was warning me. Dana Alvarez was 28 years old when she rented a small house in a quiet suburb. The kind of neighborhood that feels like it was designed to feel safe, with maintained lawns and curtains drawn to just the right height, and a specific silence in the evenings that could be comforting if you let it, and her neighbor across the street, a man in his late 70s named Arthur Kowalski, who had lived alone since the death of his wife and spent his waking hours on his covered front porch, watching the street with the patient attention of someone who has decided that watching is a worthy use of the time he has left. Simply part of the visual landscape of Dana's mornings, in the way that a particular tree or lamppost becomes part of a route you travel without consciously seeing. And they had a routine. She would leave for work at 7:45. Arthur would be on the porch. Arthur would raise one hand in a slow flat wave. She would wave back from the driveway. And that was the entirety of their relationship for nearly 8 months. Cordial and distant and entirely without depth. And then one afternoon, Arthur was not on the porch, and the next day he was not. And on a Thursday evening coming home at just past. And on a Thursday evening coming home at just hand. And on severed Symes cement, scanned of sound, he was moving his hand. He was moving his send. He was end to send. As is a send says as em send. As em present, as em zin and sim and ben and spin percent bath club and up and my din up and I to promise the weapon to this up so I was a come by your eye the tower final and with the and when she got out of her car, he began moving toward her faster than she had ever seen him move. And something about the combination of his speed and the expression on his face, which she later described as a person trying very hard to communicate something they did not have words for, frightened her in a way she was ashamed of. And she said a quick and clipped hello and went inside and locked the door and hated herself a little for it. And 2 weeks later, she learned from another neighbor that Arthur Kowalski had passed away in his home, apparently of a heart attack, undiscovered for 2 days. And his daughter had come to settle the estate and came to Dana first because Arthur had spoken about her, had mentioned her by name, and asked whether Dana would help sort through some of his things. And Dana said yes, and spent a Saturday morning in that quiet house across the street, going through drawers and shelves. And in the small office off the living room, she found a composition notebook on the desk, the cover softened with handling, the pages dense with Arthur Kowalski's handwriting, careful even, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was taken seriously. And the first 3/4 of the notebook were the ordinary documentation of a careful life. Grocery lists, appointment records, notes from phone calls with his daughter. The kind of meticulous record-keeping that speaks to a man who trusts very few things but trusts a notebook, and then roughly 3 months before his death the entries changed, and the new entries were about Dana's house, and about the man Arthur had been watching come to it. And the entries were methodical and dated and precise, in the way that the entries of a man who knows he is documenting something important are precise. what time the man arrived, what time he left, what he wore, which door he used, how long he stayed, and there were dozens of these entries across weeks of careful observation, and Arthur had noted in his measured handwriting that the man always arrived while Dana was at work, and always left before she returned, and always used a key, the same key, inserted into the front lock without hesitation or fumbling, the practiced ease of a man using a key he has used many times before. And in one entry Arthur had written, "She does not know how it has not know you. I does not know, no. I just not know, no. You know, not what I'm practicing." The practiced ease of a man using a prefix of a slash eps. He has used many teams at 17 as you. He has men. I have was. It have event. But it is at. But I said dub. But I said don't I said I said so I said I'd well I said so was and so 7 so 1 and up says it and so what but I said a self so all the said 7 sef sense sub so we sef sense it's just that I wobble to the part as that and the summer I do I want to when I'm aware that one more sometime I cannot seem to make her understand. I will try again. And the final entry in the notebook, dated 2 days before Arthur Kowalski died, was 4 sentences long and read. He saw me on the porch today. He stood at her door for a moment before going in and looked directly at me across the street. He looked for a long time. I do not think I should sit on the porch anymore. And Dana went home and called the police, and a locksmith they sent confirmed what Arthur had spent weeks watching. The front lock had been rekeyed from the inside by someone who knew what they were doing, a duplicate key cut, and the original hardware replaced so precisely that there was nothing visible to suggest anything had changed. And the police asked Dana who might have access, who might have had a reason, and Dana gave them names and could not find one that felt right. And in the weeks that followed, living in a house whose locks had been changed and whose previous violation felt written into the walls, the question Dana could not set down was not about the man with the key or what he had done in the hours he spent inside her home while she worked, and what the man across the street had seen in Arthur's face from the doorstep that day, and whether the heart attack 2 days later was what it appeared to be. And every rational part of Dana insisted, yes, of course, a coincidence, an old man with a weak heart, of course, and every other part of her kept returning to the fact that Arthur Kowalski had sat on that porch through 8 Michigan winters and outlasted everyone who loved him and had not been afraid of very much. And the last thing he had written in his neat, careful hand was that he did not think he should sit on the porch anymore, and then 2 days later he was gone. Story 3. He waved back. Nathan Cole was 44 years old, a high school history teacher who had lived with his wife, Carrie, in a farmhouse at the end of a half-mile private drive for 11 years, the kind of property that people who are driving past call peaceful, and that is only called peaceful by people who have never lived with the specific quality of silence that settles over an open field after dark. When the tree line goes black and the nearest neighbor is half a mile of empty road away, and that neighbor an older man named Gerald, who had worked the adjacent land since before Nathan and Carrie bought the farmhouse, was the kind of neighbor you waved to without knowing. A shape at thence neighbor, a slow rest hand across the field neighbor, and it had been Nathan's habit for years. Every evening before dinner, to close the front blinds, and in the moment before doing so, to look across the dark field toward the tree line at the far edge of Gerald's property, where Gerald had a habit of standing in the early evening watching the light go, the way certain older people watch the light go, as if they've decided it deserves the attention, and Nathan would raise his hand, and Gerald, a dark shape against the darker line of the trees at that distance, would raise his hand back, and Nathan would close the blinds, and it was nothing. It was the smallest possible acknowledgement between two people who shared a boundary but not a friendship. And habits become invisible, and the things we do without thinking are the things we stop truly seeing. And one evening at dinner, Carrie mentioned Gerald in passing, something about a county tax assessment she'd read about, and Nathan said, without looking up, "I was just waving to him before dinner." And Carrie set down her fork and looked at him across the table and said carefully, "Nathan Gerald moved to his daughter's place in Columbus. About 3 weeks ago, she came and got him. I thought you knew. His property is empty." And Nathan sat with his fork in his hand, and the kitchen was very quiet, and then he got up from the table and went to the front window and looked out across the open field toward the tree line, and there, at the edge of the trees, in the exact spot where Gerald had always stood, was a shape. And Nathan raised his hand slowly, and the shape raised its hand back, and Nathan stepped away from the window and called the county sheriff's office. And 2 deputies came out within the hour and walked the property with flashlights and searched the tree line and the edge of Gerald's vacant land. And at the base of a particular oak tree at the tree line, they found a worn depression in the earth where something had stood repeatedly for a long time. The grass pressed flat and dead in a human-shaped area, and scattered in the leaves around it were cigarette butts, dozens, not a handful, dozens, and the compressed ring of ground that a thermos leaves when set in the same spot enough times, and boot prints in the soft earth, heading toward the road in a direction that suggested parking out of sight and walking in on fight. And the deputies found no one, and advised Nathan to consider a security, and the deputies is fowing to sound it, pal to canal to do ascend. And in fair to man and an end, a menace a pen to and pun to pun and pun but it paint and attend other tend to my words to the up a mess me white out and would when I saw my toy with the sallow I would just it up would wasn't I found me with a get my foot out to the soup but it didn't do but it didn't what it is in a mama with we got my dip my road if it had them. And Nathan had cameras installed the following week covering every angle of the property, and the weeks that followed passed without incident. No shape at the tree line, no movement in the field, and Nathan began the slow work of talking himself out of it. A hunter, maybe, or a trespasser who meant nothing. Someone who had found a quiet spot and happened to mirror his wave without realizing what they were mirroring. And 3 months passed, and then one evening the security system sent a motion alert to his phone from 2 days prior that he hadn't checked. And Nathan opened the footage on his laptop, and the camera that had flagged the event was one he had half forgotten about. A camera covering the back exterior of the house, the wall with the kitchen window, and the footage was from a Tuesday evening at 6:48 p.m. And Nathan watched it, and he watched himself appear in the lit kitchen window, saw himself from outside as he reached for the cord of the front blinds, watched himself pause and look out. He knew, watching from the outside, that in this moment he was looking across the front field. that in this moment he was raising his hand and standing in the darkness outside the kitchen window at the back of the house. Face turned toward Nathan's profile through the glass, close enough to the window that the footage could resolve the outline of a figure in detail, was a person, motionless and patient, watching Nathan from behind while Nathan stood at the front of the house and waved to the tree line, and Nathan went back through the footage every evening that week, and the figure was there every time. In the same place, same posture, never moving until Nathan turned off the kitchen light and moved away from the window, and Nathan understood something then in the way you understand things, that rearrange what you thought was solid, that the shape at the tree line and the shape at the kitchen window were not the same shape, that the footprints leading from the road to the oak tree and the footprints the deputies had not thought to look for outside the kitchen window at the back of the house were made by different feet, and that every evening for at least 3 months, while he stood at his front window and waved at one figure across the field, a second figure had been standing at the back of his house watching him do it. And Nathan said later that the part that stayed with him, the part that he couldn't reason away in the daylight or drink away at night, was not the fear of what two people in the dark outside his home might have intended. It was the image of the figure at the kitchen window, perfectly still, watching him raise his hand toward the tree line. And the question of what expression it wore while it watched, and whether in the 3 months before he installed the cameras, it had been standing at that window every single evening, or only some of them, and whether he would ever know the difference. 3 homes, 3 people who believed they were alone, 3 realities that turned out to be something else entirely. The thing about these stories, the thing that makes them different from ghost stories, is different from monsters, is that everything in them is possible. Right now, in any building, on any street, behind any wall, with a gap in it that no one ever thought to check. Safety is not always what it feels like. Sometimes it's just the absence of information you haven't found yet. If tonight's stories found their way under your skin, if you're already thinking about the room behind you, subscribe to True Terror Files Official and turn on notifications. We go deeper every single week. Drop a comment and tell me which story hit hardest. I read every one. Stay aware out there. And before you go to sleep tonight, check every room.